Please stand as you're able for the reading of the Holy Gospel according to St. Luke. Now large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and he turned and said to them, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not first sit down and estimate the cost to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it will begin to ridicule him, saying, 'This fellow began to build and was not able to finish.' Or what king, going out to wage war against another king, will not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If he cannot, then while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for the terms of peace. So therefore, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Please be seated. We drove through the mountain pass in Colorado, one high and rocky mountain after another, all around us. After a while, we came down into a valley, crossed a small bridge that had a creek flowing beneath it. There was a road sign on the bridge. It said, "Arkansas River." One of the scout leaders turned to me. He said, "That's where we're going rafting." It didn't look like much. We kept driving. The high plains getting wider, the surrounding mountains around us getting taller. Pulled into the rafting outpost and checked in. They gave us flotation jackets, paddles, helmets. This was getting more serious. We stepped onto the bus that would drive us to the spot on the river where we would put in. And as we rode the bus, the chief guide stood up and introduced himself. "Hi, my name's Catfish." You know there's a story behind that. "How many of you have never done this before?" Most of us raised our hands. "Okay," he said, "this is a bus. It's like a big car." After we laughed, he got down to business. He walked over to me and handed me a clipboard. He said, "I need you to check off each item on this list as I talk about it." It was a long list. Things like what to do if you fall into the river, how to keep yourself in the boat, how not to get sucked underwater, how to get rescued, how to pull someone back in the boat, what to do if your raft gets stuck. Finally, we got to the river. Carried our rafts down the steep bank, down to the shore. Catfish had described to us all the potential difficulties we might face, as well as the actions that might be required of us in order to successfully complete our rafting adventure. At each stage of the journey up until that moment, we had the option to turn back, to say, "No, this is too much for me. I can't commit myself to doing this." Now, Catfish and the other guides didn't want us to turn back, of course. They loved rafting, and they not only made their living from it, but they enjoyed teaching it to other people. But before they could take us on the river, they had to ask us to count the cost, to consider the difficulties as well as the benefits, and they needed each of us to reach a conclusion that this trip would be possible and worthwhile. If any of us couldn't come to that conclusion, then we should probably stay on dry land. Because once we actually got into the raft, we had to be all in, fully committed. There was a similar dynamic at play in the gospel reading we heard today from Luke 14. Large crowds were traveling around with Jesus. They loved the healings, the hospitality, the hope that he offered. They wanted to learn more. They wanted to follow him and experience life according to his way. Yet Jesus was at the point in his ministry where he was getting ready to go to Jerusalem, to go to the cross. The hardest part was still coming. If the crowds were going to keep following him, he needed to be honest about the difficulties ahead. He needed them to count the cost, to consider the potential challenges and benefits that lay ahead, and to each reach their own conclusion about whether the road of discipleship ahead of them would be possible and worthwhile. And so we hear some very harsh language that Jesus speaks to the crowd. Whoever does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. None of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions. You've got to count the cost. You've got to commit to being all in. I think with some of the examples Jesus uses here, he's kind of exaggerating to make a point. He doesn't want us to hate anybody, especially not our own families. Jesus didn't hate anybody, and he loved life. When you look at the gospel story in its entirety, Jesus' biggest message and his way of life was all about love. Our love for one another and our neighbors, our love for Jesus, and most of all, God's love for us and for the whole world. Yet, fulfilling Jesus' way of love, actually putting it into practice in our own lives and among our family and friends and neighbors and in our communities and workplaces and schools, in society at large, well, that can be very challenging. It can feel like getting into a raft on an unknown stretch of Whitewater River. And once you get in, you've got to be all in and be committed to stick with it and keep learning and moving ahead in faith, even when you know there will be difficulties ahead. Back on the Arkansas River, once we got floating through all of those rapids, we went through our share of difficulties. Each of us got completely soaked many times over. Once our raft actually got folded in half by the swirling waves at the end of a big rapid, and the guy in front of me, he was glad he was wearing a helmet because my paddle hit him in the head. So I said, "That's why you wear a helmet." In another spot, they warned us that if you fell in, the river would suck you down into an 83-foot deep sinkhole and then spit you out 30 yards downriver. We all managed to stay in the raft for that one. But with each rapid, we gained a little more experience and ability. And we listened for the instructions from our guide, Paxton, who we gained complete confidence in. In return, Paxton trusted us enough to ask if we wanted the easier or the harder routes on each section of Whitewater. And guess what? Our boys always chose the harder one. We couldn't have done it without our guide. But by following his lead and listening for his instructions, a river that would have been impossible for us to navigate on our own became something manageable and worthwhile because we went all in on it together. In a similar way, we have a guide who will help us navigate the way of discipleship. That guide is Jesus Christ. He asks us to count the cost of what it means to follow him and to live according to his way of love. And he asks us to follow him with confidence because he has already paid the cost and gone all in for us. He went to the cross on our behalf to defeat the power of sin and death, and he rose again from the grave to fulfill God's promise that Christ's way of love is the way to abundant and worthwhile life. Even when that way becomes difficult and we go through one challenge after another, Jesus is our expert guide who will lead us to new life and salvation. Even when following him feels difficult, it is not impossible because Jesus himself is right by your side. And he trusts us to commit ourselves to be all in for listening for his voice and bit by bit gaining experience and ability as his followers and doing it together. Amen.